Research I'm presenting here was actually the subject of my master's thesis for the Applied Critical Archaeology and Heritage course at the University of Bologna, the master's course. And it's on the use of lost wax casting techniques on early bronze metallurgy, specifically this type of dagger from the Unetice culture. So we're just going to go over some important parts of the research, including the theoretical framework, and then look at some existing archaeological evidence that I had to reference in order to understand the context of the object and of the lost wax method itself. After which we can look at the methodology, the data set, and finally the experimental process, which was pretty extensive. So I'm quite excited to talk about that. So, basis of my research was to address the gap in knowledge surrounding the use of the lost wax method. Modern archaeologists do know that the lost wax method was used pretty extensively for quite small, delicate objects, since it was the only way to form and preserve very intricate decorations. For my thesis research in particular, I was focusing on the reproduction of a particular kind of dagger from the Unetice culture, which existed in Central Europe during the early Bronze Age. And you might have noticed at the beginning of the presentation that dagger has these very, very intricate designs that in many cases were not incised after casting. They were made before casting, which sort of ascribes to the use of the lost wax technique. So my questions were, what technical knowledge was required to produce this type of object, but also to determine the effectiveness of the lost wax technique in creating the decorations unique to this typological object. My theoretical framework, of course, the three most important pillars of my research were experimental archaeology itself, the chaîne opératoire, and production, organization, and technical knowledge. So just for, I'm sure you've all heard of experimental archaeology, but just as a recap, it's the reconstruction of past buildings, technologies, objects, and context based on archaeological evidence, but specifically, it is done in the way that they would have done it in the past. That is to say, you don't use modern tools or specialized equipment. You try to do things as quote unquote traditionally as possible. Experimental archaeology is quite an important sub-discipline within archaeology, since it sort of furthers the scientific positivist approach that archaeologists have towards the study. Secondly, there's the chaîne opératoire. This was first conceptualized by André Leroy-Gourhan in 1964 as sort of a framework for the study of not just the objects, but the entire life cycle of the objects. You've probably heard the term object biography, and this is a very important part of that. It's sort of, the chaîne opératoire describes the entire life cycle of the object, from raw material all the way to its deposition. And then, of course, there's production, organization, and technical knowledge, since, well, to put it bluntly, knowing what you're doing is quite important. So it's also important for me to properly research the techniques and skills necessary. For this figure on the side, that comes from a paper by M.K. Kuipers, who is currently an expert on bronze archaeometallurgy, which of course is the focus of this research. So before I could do anything, I sort of had to determine how prevalent was the use of beeswax in the distant past. And in particular, in that note, what's the evidence for beekeeping within the archaeological record? It's actually quite extensive. Most of the evidence we have for ancient beekeeping is from Iron Age and Roman sources, but we do have some evidence from earlier sites, mostly through modern scientific analysis like palynology, lipid residue analysis, and gas chromatography. Some of the oldest evidence for the use of beeswax comes from Neolithic sites in Spain, southern Spain specifically. And just here I've put the name of a collection of papers called New Approaches to the Archaeology of Beekeeping by Wallace Hare. That was published in 2021, since it's an extremely concise collection of evidence and research regarding the presence of beeswax in the archaeological record. Specifically, this chart is a collection of articles, many of which come from that aforementioned collection. But as you can see, there is quite a substantial number of sources, particularly from ceramic analysis, that shows that beeswax was actually used quite extensively. I also needed to do some ethnographic research, since the lost wax technique is still used quite extensively today. Modern uses of the lost wax technique mostly come from the use of for making jewelry. Modern jewelry makers will create resin molds using a similar technique wherein they melt the wax out. But if we're talking about the use of beeswax in the traditional way, then the two most relevant ethnographic examples of this are the Indian dokra technique and Benin bronze casting. Dokra has been used for around 5,000 years. The Indus River Valley civilization in particular has quite a few objects that have been ascribed to the use of the lost wax technique, including the dancing girl statuette. And recently, an amulet was found in Negra, I believe, that was also found to have been made using the lost wax method. Dokra in particular is, as it is practiced today, is an indirect casting. That is to say, you make a form out of clay, you then apply the beeswax over that model, and then that is encased in the mold, which is a combination of clay, sand, and usually an organic material, in this case often rice chaff. And the casting process of this, once the pore has been removed, is by either pouring the molten metal directly into the mold or by placing the metal directly into it and then allowing that to melt. But the point is that the presence of lost wax casting is still very much prevalent, especially in traditional art forms. But archaeological evidence for lost wax casting is a little more difficult to understand, since the problem with beeswax is that it's an organic material. And if you know anything about the preservation of organic materials, is that it's near impossible for something like beeswax to remain in the archaeological record, since it will just eventually disappear, unless, of course, it's been preserved in an incredibly arid or an incredibly frigid environment. It's quite difficult to see. Modern analytic techniques, like I mentioned, lipid residue analysis, mass spectrometry, have made it easier to identify the presence of organic materials, especially wax, in the archaeological record. But if we were talking about macroscopic, visible to the naked eye evidence, there's not that much. However, there is quite a large body of evidence for lost wax casting in Europe that comes from what's now modern day Poland, specifically from southwestern Poland, around the area of Krakow. Most of the analysis that was done has been conducted through, as you can see, X-ray diffraction analysis, fluorescence spectrometry, and microanalysis. But there is quite a large body of evidence from this area that suggests the use of, or confirms the use of, the lost wax technique. So now I want to talk a bit about the archaeological culture that is predominant in this part of Poland, and of which the dagger that I was attempting to recreate could be ascribed to, and that is the Unetice. The Unetice were a Bronze Age civilization that extended across most of Poland, southern Germany, and even down as far as Slovakia in some cases. Some really well-known and famous Central European archaeological sites, like the tumuluses at Löbingen, Helmsdorf, and Bornhoek, can all be related to the circumference group of the Unetice culture, and famous sites in Poland, including the Leke Male burial tombs and the Bronze Age site of Bruszczewo. Excuse me, my Polish isn't that good. Are also part of the Unetice culture. The image that you see on the right is a particularly famous object called the Nebra sky disk, and this particular object has been dated to 1600 BC, so really the tail end of the Unetice culture in Europe. But they are particularly well known for their production of bronze objects, especially ingots, bracelets, axes, all sorts of really beautiful, intricate objects. And all of them have decorative elements that are common across all of the objects, as you'll see when we get to the methodology dataset. Which, yes. So, already said, the purpose of this thesis is to determine the chaîne opératoire and the craft techniques used in the production of a solid hilt dagger, also called a Vollgriffdolch in German. This particular example is currently in the Museo Nazionale di Parma. It was apparently found near Parma, but was donated by an unknown individual, so we can't be sure of its exact context. A hoard of similar bronze daggers were found in Parma at around the same time, so it's possible that these objects were related. So you can see from left to right is an illustration of the dagger in Peroni's 1994 catalog. Then there's a photo I took of the actual dagger at the museum, which the curator of the Archaeological Museum, Angelo Muti, was kind enough to let me actually handle. And on the far right is another replica of that dagger made by the Swiss metallurgists Marcus Bingeli and Marcus Bingeli. This particular example was not made with the lost wax technique, but this is sort of an example of what it would have looked like before its deposition. So, as I said before, the Unetice culture daggers have a very particular type of decorative element that's common across basically all of their objects. And during my research, I actually found that the dagger from Parma is most typologically reminiscent of a particular hoard of daggers found at the Unetice site of Horomerice. These daggers are illustrated in Peter Novak's Die Dolken in Tschechien, and they have very similar decorations up to the point of even the decorations on the blade of the dagger being almost identical. So the types of daggers that are most commonly found in northern Italy that are related to this typology are usually found in sites of the Polare, Terramare, and Grotta Nuova cultures. Some isotope analysis on these daggers have revealed that most of them are made with Falor copper from the Eastern Alps. And this is true of both daggers found within Italy and also of daggers found in Central Europe, in Poland and Germany. Generally speaking, these daggers appear to be related, so which is why we can say that they're both from the Unetice culture. These are some other pictures I took to sort of emphasize the types of decorations on these daggers. You can see that they are extremely, extremely detailed and intricate. The actual, they're not even very deep, these decorations. They're really just very lightly incised into the surface. But as you can see, closer analysis reveals that these decorations were not incised after casting, as I've said. Hence why I wanted to look into the production of these daggers using the lost wax casting technique, since it is the only other way that these decorations could have been made, essentially. Okay. Is the experimental process part, which is what I'm most excited to talk about. There were 4 different processes for me, since I was lucky enough to actually get my hands on a block of unpurified beeswax. So the very first thing that I had to do was purify the beeswax myself. Unfortunately, there's no pictures of that in this presentation. But once I had purified the beeswax, I worked on creating the mold for the dagger. If you remember back to the section on ethnographic research, when I spoke about dokra and how that's a form of indirect casting, this is direct casting. Essentially, I made the model out of just beeswax. There's no clay core around, inside the object. Now, the process of making these daggers, you can very easily see from left to right the slow improvement of my own ability to make these wax daggers. Admittedly, they're not fantastic, but I found working with beeswax that it is a very difficult material to work with. It's thermoplastic, which means that upon exposure to heat, it'll start bending and becoming malleable. But the moment it becomes cold again, it's incredibly hard. And that sort of variability in its structure, once you understand how to use it, it makes it a very malleable and useful material to work with, especially if you're trying to make a model like this. But if you look closely at the pictures, you can see that I attempted to make the incisions with essentially what amounted to a needle. My first incisions, the first 4 daggers, I carved the lines far too deeply. However, when I was discussing with the 2 metallurgists who made the other replica dagger, they taught me some things about wax, and one of these facts was that with lost wax casting, if you're creating very delicate decorations, you don't need to press too hard as you make them. A very fine incision will be just as visible in the final product as creating very deep incisions. Then we created molds for the daggers. Now, many of the molds didn't succeed. As you can see from the left, one of them cracked during the drying process. And the actual process for most of the daggers, we used a modern kiln to melt the wax out, but that was primarily due to time constraints. Had that not been the case, we would have done all of the molds the way that you see on the right, which is the more traditional way, where you place it over a fire, and as the clay heats up, the wax model melts away, essentially. That's why it's called the lost wax technique. You lose the wax in the end. And finally, we have the experimental process. I hope that the video is visible for everyone. The casting process was done at the Museo Terramare di Montale with the assistance of the experimental archaeometallurgy group Ep.49. As you can see, we used hand bellows, which is a more archaic way of smelting the metal. Bronze ingots we used were 10% tin alloy, since most Unetice bronze objects are about 8 to 10% tin. And the amount of tin percentage is quite important in the casting of bronze objects, since the more tin is in your object, the more brittle it becomes. So 10%, you get a reasonably hard object. And as you can see in the background there, the mold was placed in a bucket with sand to keep it upright. The fire itself, the center, since the melting point of copper is about 1080 degrees, we didn't use copper, but the fire at the very center was still more than 1000 degrees, which assists with the smelting process. So when it came to casting the daggers, we ended up with 3 daggers. The first 2 were somewhat successful, but the one on the far right is definitely the most complete in terms of visible decorations. The 2 on the left were from the daggers I had made previously, and I had incised far too deeply into the wax, and you can see that the decorations are not as fine as on the original object. The dagger on the far right, unfortunately, as it was being cast, too much air got in the way of the bronze, and it created this very bubbly surface. But what decorations are visible on that dagger, as you can see, are very reminiscent of the original object, which I should say sort of indicates that, yes, it would have been possible to use the lost wax method to create this type of dagger. But the survivability of the decorations, both in the bronze and on the mold itself, sort of depends on the quality of the clay. The first molds we made were with very coarse clay that was retrieved from just the hills in the Apennine Mountains, while the clay of the mold you can see on the right was a refractory porcelain clay. So the mold survived the casting process quite well. Speaking of the inside of the molds, I wanted to show off these examples since it sort of is quite indicative of the validity of using the lost wax method for this kind of object. The dagger on the left was an unsuccessful attempt, but as we removed the mold from it, we retrieved these 2 pieces of the mold in the middle. And as you can see, the decorations are incredibly visible within the clay itself. And this was as I mentioned, this was the not so high quality Apennine clay. And if you sort of squint, you can also see on the far right that these decorations are also visible at the top of this piece of broken mold, again from the Apennine clay. So what does this all conclude to? Essentially, the fact that, sorry, the use of the lost wax technique, particular for this type of object, is not only valid, but likely would have been one of the primary ways in which these solid hilt daggers or Volgriff-Doltke might have been made. But also, when we're talking about efficiency and effectiveness of the technique, that this is an example of cross-craft interaction. here being the borrowing of styles or manufacturing techniques. This flowchart model that I made as I was participating in the process of making the entire dagger shows off that fact. So 3 different types of crafts would have to come together to create a single object. So the beeswax, the raw clay, and even just acquiring the bronze all have to come together seamlessly in order to produce a finished object, which in itself is already difficult. And that sort of goes hand in hand with the quality of the object itself. There's sort of, I forgot to mention this earlier, excuse me, but the type of dagger that this is, it's an extremely fine piece of work. It's art, essentially. So it's likely that this dagger would not have been used for everyday activities. Likely it was more of a ritual object. And the level of complexity and difficulty of this process, as I have found, sort of lends itself to this idea that, yes, this object is something special, as it were. But if we're talking about the lost wax technique, it's difficult, it's very finicky, but the lost wax technique is definitely a valid way to produce this type of object. Which, the 2 questions that were posed at the beginning, what technical knowledge was required and what was the effectiveness? I think the answers to that, as I've shown, are that A, there's 3 different types of technical knowledge that were required, but the effectiveness of the technique is something that would need to be practiced. It can work, you can make a dagger using this technique, but it would have to be performed by someone with incredible knowledge of bronze casting and an understanding of wax and the properties of it. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you.